After 1 year of war, Gaza's health authority, which is controlled by Hamas, says the death toll from the conflict with Israel is nearing 42,000 people. Numbers the UN says are reliable. Overnight, at least 26 people have been killed in Israeli airstrikes on the Bureij refugee camp in central Gaza, including children. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists his country will achieve what he calls total victory over Hamas, which launched the October 7 terror attacks against Israel a year ago. Now, the violence has trapped the civilian population of Gaza in the crossfire, enduring widespread hunger, disease and the collapse of the healthcare system.
This is where the Tambura family call home, but only for now. Theirs is one of thousands of tents near the beach in central Gaza. They were forced to leave their real home in northern Gaza last October. After Hamas-led militants from Gaza brutally attacked southern Israeli communities, Israel retaliated with an air offensive and later a ground invasion. Arish, her husband Abdul Salam and their grandchildren have been on the move for the past 12 months, like tens of thousands of other Palestinians in Gaza.
We were displaced by the bombing. Wherever we went, there were massacres. We would leave one place struck by tragedy only to arrive at another place where a new bombing unfolded. Every place we fled to became another scene of devastation.
They sought shelter in several schools in northern Gaza, then fled south to central Gaza, to Rafah, to Khan Yunis and back to the center. They're among the almost 90% of Gaza's 2.2 million people forcibly displaced by war. The family is now dispersed across Gaza. Arish says she never expected to end up living in a tent. They have no income and depend on aid and charity. The children no longer have schooling and help as much as they can.
Now, instead of carrying school bags, they carry water. When I see my children or others' children do this, I feel the pain deeply.
Fear of airstrikes is a constant. Both have lost close family members in such attacks. Arish says she lost her sister in an airstrike last October.
At midnight, we were screaming, not knowing who had died or who had survived. By morning, they told us we couldn't say goodbye to our loved ones because their bodies were in such a terrible state. I never got to say goodbye to my sister or her children. We buried them all, 11 children, 5 women and the men. The loss of my sister and her family has affected me deeply.
شوف قديش استشهدوا هذا الإشي أثر في كتير فقدت أختي.
I lost my brother and his daughters when their tent was bombed near the UNRWA warehouses. They were all killed. His son was injured by shrapnel. I buried my brother in Rafah and on the same day fled with my family.
Arish fears she may never be allowed to return to her home in northern Gaza. The war has not only destroyed vast areas of the territory, but has also effectively divided it into north and south. The return of displaced people to the north is part of the ceasefire negotiations, which have so far failed.
I have a boy and 2 girls in the north, and I just want to hug them. The most important thing is to hold my children again. I'm afraid I will die before I get to embrace my son and daughters. I miss them so much. I can't breathe. It makes me feel sick because I'm far away from them.
It is a simple wish, but while Gaza was no stranger to war in the past, this is the longest its people have endured such unremitting violence, death and destruction, with no end in sight.
Bart Witteveen is country director for the occupied Palestinian territory at the NGO International Rescue Committee. He joins me from Amman in Jordan. Bart, we heard in our report from this displaced family in Gaza. How common are these stories?
Yeah, I think the scenes and the testimony that you used in your introduction speak for themselves, where the impact over the past year has really been devastating on Gaza, and the implications in terms of the humanitarian impact are quite extraordinary. I think those quick testimonies really give an impression of the acute level of need that exists in the Gaza Strip.
Now, since the beginning of the war, access to Gaza and the supply of humanitarian aid have been a bit of a problem. Is it any different now, 1 year later?
Qualifying it as a problem is an understatement. It has been extraordinarily difficult to ensure access of humanitarian supplies into Gaza. It's almost as if the quantity of supplies has been calibrated over this period, where we are really facing a whole range of constraints simply in terms of getting humanitarian supplies across the border into Gaza. As we speak, we are facing another period of growing constraints, where the number of, just as an indicator, the number of trucks that have been able to cross the border into Gaza has reduced precipitously. To give you an impression, from approximately 200 trucks per day to in the order of less than 50 trucks a day. Under these conditions, the humanitarian response is really very, very difficult, and I would argue is unsustainable.
Now, in recent weeks, Israel has increasingly focused its military operations on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Has this somehow changed the situation in Gaza?
I don't think it has made a significant change on the situation in Gaza. As I mentioned, the constraints in terms of humanitarian cargo getting into Gaza has actually become more difficult over the last week to 10 days. In terms of violence and conflict in Gaza, military operations are ongoing, and the strategy of rolling out what is referred to as evacuation orders, or what we as humanitarians refer to as forced displacement orders, is really at a rate that it has been over the last couple of months. And this is a strategy of forcing people to move from one area to the other in the wake or preceding military operations. In that sense, the situation remains the same, and in some sense we feel that it may deteriorate further.
Now, about the future of Gaza, if we're looking at the images that we're constantly seeing of the total bombed out territory, is there anything that gives you hope for Gaza and its people?
You pose a very challenging proposition. We obviously are focused on our day-to-day operations, which, as I have indicated, are under very difficult circumstances. Obviously, we need to maintain some degree of hope, the ultimate solution being a meaningful ceasefire. But I'm afraid I have no indicators on the immediate horizon to feed that hope.
Bart Witteveen with the International Rescue Committee, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more, we can speak now with Shaina Low. She's a communication advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council and joins us today from Oslo. Shaina, it's been a year now since the war started between Israel and Hamas. You're in close contact with your colleagues on the ground in the region there. What are they telling you about the humanitarian situation in Gaza at this point?
Good morning, Terry. I've been in touch with a colleague over the last couple of days. What he's telling me is just that the situation unimaginably continues to deteriorate day by day. We just had northern Gaza put under evacuation orders yet again, as Israel tries to force around an estimated 431,000 Palestinians who remained in the north to flee to the south. where there's limited space for them, limited humanitarian assistance available. Really, the situation, as I've been saying for a year, could not get more dire. But time and day after day, the situation does get more dire as needs continue to increase and the amount of aid entering Gaza has actually decreased.
Now, you've been very active in the last months to raise awareness about the situation of Palestinian civilians. You and I have spoken multiple times over the months. 1 year into the war, do you see a change in public perception of what's happening there?
It's hard to know. I'm sitting here in Oslo yesterday, and there were marches on the streets here. We see that that ordinary people across the world have been speaking out, calling for the need for a ceasefire, calling for the need to protect civilians. But unfortunately, what we're seeing from the international community, from world leaders, is a failure to act, a failure to force the parties to come to an agreement, to have a ceasefire, and to allow people, Palestinians in Gaza, to begin the recovery and reconstruction. So I think we've seen an outpouring of support and solidarity for civilians on both sides, but in particular Palestinians who have been suffering a year of hostilities. But we've seen that our world leaders continue to fail us in putting an end to this fighting.
1 year into the war, there's still no ceasefire in sight. Do you think the international community, Shaina, should be doing more to stop the war and relieve the suffering in Gaza? And what do you think they should do?
Well, there are a few things. First and foremost, they can stop fueling the fire and stop sending arms to Israel and to Palestinian armed groups. That is a number one thing that world leaders can do to put an end to this fighting. Secondly, we need to see the international community put more pressure on Israel to allow a surge of aid to enter. For months, we've been calling for an opening of all the crossings. For months, we've been calling on Israel to remove its screening processes or ease those screening processes to allow for aid to enter Gaza more quickly so that we can scale up our operations. For months, we've been calling for a ceasefire so that we can safely reach and access people who are in need throughout Gaza and ensure that humanitarians and civilians seeking humanitarian relief are protected. And so these are the three things: a ceasefire, an end to arms transfers, and a huge scaling up of aid that we desperately need in order to save Palestinian lives and to prevent this conflict from continuing on.
Israel has now launched offensives in Lebanon, taking on Hezbollah up there. That has also created a humanitarian disaster of sorts. What are you seeing now with the shift of focus to Lebanon? Is Gaza being forgotten there, and how much support is needed in Lebanon?
I think for sure there's a limited attention span that the international community has, and attention is obviously being spread around as we see hostilities increase in Lebanon, risks of a further regional war, including Iran and other actors in the region, and we desperately need to call for a ceasefire in all of these areas. I think it's been a year of suffering, and as attention shifts elsewhere, we could see these hostilities going on for months and months with no end and no pressure to put an end to it, and an increased suffering of civilians throughout the region.
Shaina, thank you very much for talking with us today. It was Shaina Low from the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Thank you, Terry.